stuff to cover. This will be our plenary on modern slavery. I had a real quick announcement first. We will be ending this session a couple minutes early. You'll know we'll still have time for Q&A at the end. It's still going to be at least 90 minutes long, so it's a good long chunk. And I also wanted folks to say thank you to everyone for being here. And also, we are still recruiting for our concluding plenary tomorrow, the last thing we do, hence concluding plenary. We're trying not to just keep telling everybody what's important. There are a few smart people in the audience too, right? So we're trying to make this much more interactive and get your ideas. So what should we be talking about on Friday? Please, you did some at lunch, a lot of folks who did that. There's Post-its right out in the hall and a little board. Write down ideas or questions, thoughts that you have, post them up, and sign the sign-up sheet that you will promise to be here tomorrow. And then later this afternoon or this evening, we'll be contacting certain folks with themes and identifying people to be panelists tomorrow. So it could be you. Or we could wait till everyone's in the room and then just call names and make you come up. I think we'll probably give everybody a night to think about it and think about answers. Okay? So please participate in that. First time we've done something like that, and we're really excited about how it can go. So I hope everyone's learning something, enjoying themselves as much as we can when we talk about, terrible atrocities and disappearances and all. Mm-hmm. It's a really tough thing to do. Now we're moving into a lighter topic, modern slavery. So we're going to get started. We're going to try to keep this, obviously, I think by my tone, we're going to try to keep this as informal as possible. We're going to try to get a discussion going up here amongst the panelists. And then we will stop. We'll see how things go. I might break partway through and ask for a few questions from the audience. And then we'll break again at the end for questions as well. Once again, thank you. What we're going to do is each of us is going to go around. I'm going to start with me. We'll work our way down, Valentina next, and to the end. Everyone will introduce themselves, say very briefly a little bit of background about themselves, and then tell us why they're interested in this work and why they are working in this field, in this area. This panel is on modern slavery. And when I saw that to start, I really wanted to talk about some concepts and definitions and sort of terms and kind of frame the whole thing first, very briefly. When we talk about modern slavery or modern day slavery, I think it's really important not to fall into the false dichotomy of modern slavery versus historic slavery or slavery now versus slavery then. It's slavery. It's always been slavery. There's always been slavery. This is just the contemporary manifestation of a very old phenomenon. It's a form of extreme exploitation. And that's how I see slavery is probably the most extreme form of exploitation that there is. And it has many faces, many manifestations in the modern world, and many different root causes. For myself, I think the real key root causes to slavery today are economic and social inequality and patriarchy, to be totally honest. I think those are really at the roots of almost all exploitation. And me personally, I have a little bit of a background in this area. I am the interim executive director of the Human Rights Center. I'm the co-founder, Mark and I are co-founders of Abolition Ohio, and I currently chair or direct Abolition Ohio, which is an anti-human trafficking advocacy organization across this area of Ohio. We work at the state level on issues of modern day slavery, anti-trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. We're very, very careful to try to have a very broad definition of what we consider human trafficking to be. And we've been doing this for quite a few years now. We really started in 2009, 2010, really solidifying the fact, turning a real intentional turn towards combating slavery and engaging in direct advocacy and activism to minimize slavery and human trafficking. So that's where the focus I want to have for this conversation is on really direct, practical, applied knowledge that we can use to help minimize this horrific human rights abuse and crime. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Valentina Gurney, and I work for the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility out of New York City. My job is basically shareholder advocacy. So I engage about 300 plus investors that are in our coalition with combined assets under management topping $200 billion. And we invest, of course, in some of the largest publicly traded corporations that are sometimes to blame for some of the most horrendous violations of human rights in global supply chains and in the United States. For the past 3.5 years, my job was to lead a no-fees initiative, which is ethical recruitment of migrant workers. It started with first after the scandal in Thailand, where a number of companies that were purchasing shrimp and seafood were implicated in violations of human rights and abuse of migrant workers on the fishing boats. From there, we engaged a number of other industries, and right now we're working with 6 different industries. There are electronics, apparel, travel and hospitality, tobacco. We count it as a separate industry from food and beverage, and we are thinking of venturing into construction, but we probably don't have enough holdings there. But those are some of the key industries that we work with, and our approach is to change management systems of the companies that we work with by introducing very concrete policy prescriptions that not only find their way on corporate websites and show what good practices are, but also into various other instruments that affect the supply chain, suppliers, and ultimately, of course, the workers. That's short. And I'll pass it to the next person.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Markin Slack. I'm Director of Research at the Human Rights Center. Prior to that, I was one of the faculty that helped form the Human Rights Studies program 20 years ago now, and the legacy, the Human Rights Center is in many ways a legacy of that. I have to say that our work in human trafficking was really instrumental in creating the Human Rights Center. As Tony mentioned, 2009, we had a conference on human trafficking, domestic sex trafficking, that was closed, actually, with local law enforcement. And then we had another one in 2010, at which we gave Migration and Refugee Services our Romero Award. And the outcome of that was that the community kept after us and said, this university and the nascent Human Rights Center had a role to play. And that led to the formation of Abolition Ohio. For the last 4 years, I've been directing a very different project, and I just want to give you a sense of that. 2013, I accompanied a group of faculty on a fact-finding mission to Brazil in a trip sponsored by Catholic Relief Services. And we were looking specifically at forced labor in Brazil. And at the time, I was approached by an activist on the ground who asked me a simple question. Would you do some research in this nascent Human Rights Center to answer this question? Are U.S. companies profiting from forced labor in Brazil? And so we designed a project around that. We got some funding. And I can tell you that next month or the month after, depending upon editing, we're going to publish a report in which we're going to identify more than 200 U.S. companies that have imported goods, and in some cases have regularly imported goods over 10 years, from more than 36 Brazilian suppliers that have a long history of exploitation of what Brazilians call reducing persons to conditions analogous to slavery. Very simply looking at their dirty list of companies and comparing U.S. trade. To put this in perspective for you, 3,770, 4,000 roughly. 16% of all slaves rescued in Brazil in the last 10 years have been rescued at the work sites of companies that regularly supply U.S. importers. 16% of all slaves freed in the last 10 years. And we'll talk more about it. One reason we put this panel together is to see how we can collaborate. How do we now reach out to the companies? We're not accusing them of anything. It's a violation of U.S. law to import goods made even in part with forced labor. We're not saying they are. We're saying that they're at high risk of that, and we'd like to reach out to them and ask if they'd like us to assist in addressing that risk. So that's just a taste of what will be coming, and that's one reason we organized this plenary today.
Hi, thank you so much to the University of Dayton for having me, and thank Thank you for being here today. My name is Ashley Feasley, and I'm the Director of Policy at Migration and Refugee Services, which is located within the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Many people don't know this, but Migration and Refugee Services, MRS, is the largest office within the Bishops' Conference and the only direct service component of the Bishops' Conference. At MRS, we're the largest refugee resettler in the world. For now, currently in partnership with the U.S. government. We also provide services and family reunification for unaccompanied migrant children, and we're one of 3 partners with the Department of Health and Human Services to provide trafficking victims assistance program in regions 3 and 6 in our country, which is the Mid-Atlantic and the Plains states. My job involves advocating for policies in Washington that help the programs that we work on and the Catholic Church's larger position on migration. And so some of the work that we do has both policy but personal connections. We do a lot of work to promote things like supply chain transparency and also work on things like the current pending reauthorization for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But a piece of what we do is a personal element. It's a case service model, and it's about identification, assistance, and reintegration of trafficking victims that we see in the United States that maybe are overlooked when we think about the day-to-day perception of who constitutes trafficking in the United States. I'm going to close quickly with kind of exactly what I mean with a story of a man that I had the privilege to assist through our Trafficking and Victims Assistance Program named Rolando. Rolando was from the Philippines, and he was a teacher in the Philippines. He made a decent living, but wanted to do more for his family and saw an ad for teaching positions in the United States. The pay was good, not crazy, but certainly better than what he was earning in the Philippines. So he went to the recruiter and got some of the information and was told he needed to pay a fee if he wanted to continue the process, but otherwise his paperwork looked pretty good. The fee was a pretty big fee. It was a couple months' wages for Rolando, so his family and him made the decision that they were going to move forward with the fee. He came to the United States and was, kind of hoping for the position that he was promised. However, nothing was exactly as it seemed the second he got here. He was in a school, but he was paid a fraction of what he was told that he would be able to receive. He was promised housing, and he did receive housing, but it was very subpar, and he was charged exorbitantly for this housing. Rolando, I think, felt also very, very threatened by the fact that when he came to the United States, after he had engaged the Department of Homeland Security, the person who was his point of contact immediately took away his documents. So he felt vulnerable and exposed. He also felt ashamed. He felt ashamed because he had asked his family to leverage so much money to do this and didn't really want to engage. We had the benefit of meeting Rolando through a parish outreach gathering. This was somebody who happened to come to one of our Shepherd programs, which is a Catholic outreach engagement on human trafficking. We've had some real success with Rolando's particular case. He was eligible for a T visa, which is the trafficking visa, and is moving forward with his legal permanent resident status. He is yet to be able to reunify with his family. He doesn't have the money, and the idea of having a derivative visa is very difficult. But this is, I think, a really important example when we talk about human trafficking in the United States of maybe something unexpected that you might not see. A man facing labor traffic, foreign national who came into the United States legally. And this is just an element kind of discussing recruitment fees in person.
Thank you. We have some questions prepared that we'll start to sort of frame the discussion. And this first one, we'll all get a chance to respond to it. I'm going to start with you again, Ashley, because it fits perfectly with what you just said about policy advocacy and legislative advocacy and the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It's been since 2000 since the Trafficking Victim Protection Act passed. It's been since 2000 since the Palermo Protocol was adopted. protocol to the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, essentially the U.S. national law and the international law about human trafficking, really clearly defining it, explaining it, and telling countries to do something about it and adopt laws to try to stop it. In that time, there have been, this says scores of NGOs, and I think that's really an understatement. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of NGOs that have formed around the world, specifically addressing modern slavery and human trafficking. There have been many other organizations who have adopted anti-human trafficking policies, anti-forced labor, anti-slavery policies as part of their operations, government agencies, private corporations, and across the board. And it's become, in a lot of ways, especially with human trafficking, a very popular cause that many people know about. So it's been almost 2 decades. Really, what have we learned in the past 2 decades? Have we had any lessons? Have we developed a set of best practices? Do you think yet? Do we know how to really do the 3 Ps that we need to prevent trafficking, to prosecute traffickers, and to protect the victims? And what are we good at? What aren't we good at?
Sure. So, I mean, I think you teed up the question very well. We've seen a lot of really amazing policy and international human rights developments in the last 20 years in the field of combating modern slavery and human trafficking. The Palermo Protocol is one of the most endorsed and I think upheld norms by international actors, the United States included. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and then subsequent reauthorizations really provided the U.S. framework for how we look to deal with human trafficking. It created innovative things like the T visa. It created protocols for unaccompanied children. It created protocols for prosecutors to engage, on the, prosecution of human trafficking victims. And subsequent nations also created amazing and innovative laws and national frameworks. And I think in that area, we have seen remarkable progress and success. However, I would say when it comes to the issue of implementation and rigorous actual looking at services and victim-centered approaches, we have a long way to go. We can look at the TIP report, you could look at the UNODC report, you could look at the ILO, some of the what has been used as the traditional markers, and we still see that there's much that's not known. And additionally, there's much that's hard to report as compliance. And so, as we look to the future, I think 2 areas that need to be addressed and hopefully we will work in, to do, it is greater engagement in terms of service, but also greater engagement in terms of the information gaps that we see in some of the networks that we are trying to work with and combat.
Coming this way. So I don't know in terms of what we've learned in best practices, but in terms of achievements, I mean, I think just beginning with the Palermo Protocol and the TVPA, just getting that in law, because that process in itself was a result of just the consciousness, the awareness that of modern slavery, of its magnitude and its persistence. And so getting the United States to pass TVPA, getting the United Nations to adopt the Palermo Protocol with all that entailed, having something like the TIP report, the State Department reporting on that independently of the annual Human Rights Report, getting something like the United Nations Global Compact for all some of its PR, but it's there, have the commitments to human rights, labor rights, anti-corruption, and the environment, and I think it's important. But I think it's really been sort of a grassroots thing. I think of Abolition Ohio, right? And here, when we started this, it was something as simple as getting the state of Ohio to adopt a standalone law criminalizing forced labor rather than a sort of a qualifier, an additional, an enhanced penalty for some separate crime. And that was a major achievement. And then the work that's been done in terms of raising awareness, I would venture to say, and you would know this better, Tony, because you've been on the ground, that There's probably not a state trooper here who hasn't been trained not to recognize the difference between a prostitute who's a perp and a trafficking victim, and they recognize the indicia. There's been a lot of movement there. But do the victims get the assistance that they need? I'm always reminded of one famous case many years ago where a woman was being trafficked. The police stopped her on Interstate, I think 90, in northern Ohio, and they recognized immediately that she was a trafficked person. And they rescued her, but they provided her no support, and she had been addicted to heroin, which is one of the... And a year later, she died of a heroin overdose. So she was freed from slavery, but died. And the last thing I would say was all these achievements, and I want to be careful how I frame this, I just don't think there's been enough attention to forced labor. I mean, I said controversially or sometimes, actually, enforced prostitution, sex trafficking is a form of forced labor. When you're being forced to work for someone else's benefit. The work just happens to be not sawing logs, but being forced to perform sex acts. And so that leads to sort of a larger issue I know we'll address in this, and that's the private sector. To get the private sector truly engaged, not reactively because we're about to expose them and they have to do something, but because they recognize that it's not just good for their brands and bottom lines, but that corporate social responsibility means actually truly doing something responsible for the community. So I think we've come a long way, but we all know what the gaps are, and there's never enough resources. And there's always more traffickers.
Well, I'll add to that from the perspective of companies and from the point of view of labor migration. What have we learned? Well, companies are getting more and more global, and the supply chains are getting more and more complicated. So we are covering now the territories that previously were not even assessed for risks and vulnerabilities. And there are many things that companies don't know when they go into those markets. And vulnerabilities, of course, in those markets are the contributing factor to modern-day slavery, and not just in those markets, in markets for which there are recipients for labor. So if they are a recipient country, if you talk about labor migration, there has been a huge increase in the number of people that are looking for a job overseas, be that permanently or temporarily. And of course, there has been a crisis in Syria, and there are many other refugees around the world that are looking for jobs elsewhere. And that puts them at risk for exploitation, labor exploitation. And of course, to us, modern-day slavery is anybody who is working and not getting paid. Simple as that. So what have we learned? There are policies, there are laws that prohibit the use of forced labor in supply chains. Companies can report it at their discretion. Some of these reporting mechanisms are voluntary. However, for the publicly traded corporations, we have additional levers that we use to force the companies to respond to the investors. And we apply additional pressure to get that level of deeper disclosure and what they have done to deal with the problem. And of course, that's where I come in with the policies that I prescribe to stop some of these violations. What we learned is that even if you have the best policy in the world, the implementation of that policy would take over 2 years to complete, even get to the first tier of suppliers. Because we're dealing here with the corporate practices, how long does it take for the legal department to get something approved? How long does it take for this to be communicated to subsequent documents like purchasing contracts, the communication with the suppliers? And then, of course, the auditing. There are certain mechanisms that take 180 days. Those are the auditing cycles. So before you find the problem and before you really solve it or remediate the problem that you found, there are 180 days. So that puts us at years after, and the victims of modern-day slavery will get the remediation only after all of those steps have been observed. So it's a very slow process. Another thing that we learned, to speed up the process, what was incredible is the media coverage. Companies don't like reputational pressure. They don't like to be ruined and castigated on national television for the things that are happening in their supply chains. So whenever a company has been implicated in a scandal, the response has been much quicker than that. It's not 180 days. They respond right away. And you can bet there's a policy that follows, and they will follow up, and they will change their practices. And it all depends on how much damage they've suffered. So To the students of media here, to the students of human rights, I would say, go into the media and try to cover human rights. And it's a very worthwhile thing to do because it has definitely speeded up the process. And I can vouch that in Thailand, most of the response was due to the media pressure and that coverage in The Guardian that started it all. And from there were born different NGOs, different initiatives, different programs that kind of piggybacked on that activity. Has it changed to something for the workers on the ground? Yes and no. I think we're still getting the reports that the violations are still there. And that would be my third point, that what we've learned is whenever there is a vulnerability, there will be exploitation. And it will only stop when we will address the underlying causes of why these things are happening. And that's a much more difficult thing to do.
I agree completely. Before we move on and get into that point, real briefly, media coverage. You talked about Thailand. We did a study here looking at policy diffusion of anti-human trafficking laws across all 50 states. Whether you're aware or not, all 50 states now have anti-human trafficking laws on the books. It's one of the fastest diffusing sets of laws across the whole United States. So, from the time the first state adopted a law till the 50th one did was only 10 years. And we did a time lag sort of analysis of why this was happening. And it was two things. It was the presence of major media stories, but media stories combined with connected collaborative groups of advocates active in those states. The same thing. So there was possibly a connection, but so if you even had all the advocates, but without a big media splash, it didn't work. If you had the media splash, but you didn't have the people who could really use that the right way, it didn't work. And that trumped every other effect. It didn't matter if we looked at number of women in the legislature, we looked at Republican or Democrat control, we looked at whether they were a border state or not, all the other things you could think of, nothing else was really significant at all, but those two things were highly significant. So I have to reiterate definitely what you said.
Can I, Tony, on this, companies don't like to be exposed, and that worked. In this research, we looked at a number of companies, but in 2007 there was this famous Bloomberg story about National Materials Trading in Chicago. And then suddenly GM and Ford and Kohler and all realized that they were in the supply chain, and they broke things off, and the shareholders got involved, and all sorts of things happened. One of the things I've learned is that sort of, I hope I'm wrong, I hope you see different things, that sometimes the corporate response to those is more damage control, and once the crisis, the public relations crisis is stopped, they go right back to business. Just like there'll always be vulnerability, there'll always be people who are looking to exploit the vulnerable. And I just remember some of the Brazilian partners were working on documenting greenwashing. Right? It's a lot easier for a company to go down and build a school or do something in the community that was supposedly affected than actually make the difficult corporate changes. So I think we need to be alert to that.
I agree, and that's a good segue. We can continue. I want to come back in a little bit to victim services, but since we're on the corporate, we've been talking about that, let's continue with that for a little bit. And just, that's a really good action. We can talk about corporations, and a lot of corporations have engaged in these topics. A lot of them have been drug kicking and screaming to these topics. Many have come on their own. Some have gone, they've part of their corporate culture and their values. The large corporations especially, is the private sector friend or foe when it comes to trying to eliminate modern day slavery? Do you want to start, Ashley?
Friend or foe?
Sure. I would say that both in an interesting way. We see the private sector giving real, I think, contributions in the form of technology when we look at kind of how we are trying to engage victims and also how we're looking at supply chains. But I would just say that, at the same time, corporations obviously have a financial bottom line, and using and exploiting people for their labor does make that bottom line sweeter. And so, I think that it's a more nuanced, idea. I think what's really important when you think about this issue also is the idea of, corporations and kind of where they fit in, but also how they intersect with consumers. like what we're talking about here, and remembering that consumers really are the final kind of ultimate decision makers for many corporations. And I will give a little bit of an anecdote on this. We run a Catholic coalition of organizations against human trafficking. It's the National Catholic Coalition. And we have many religious orders and dioceses, just different types of groups that are Catholic who work on this issue. 2 years ago during Lent, we ran a postcard campaign about slavery-free fishing. It coincided with a State Department grant that we have on preventing maritime fishing and trafficking and exploitation that we do in partnership with the Apostleship of the Sea and the State Department. The postcard was cute. It had a picture and it said, I'm not interested in, buying slavery and human trafficking fish during Lent. And we sent it to Starkist Tuna. So we had 55,000 of these postcards that were sent. And it's a coalition of different groups, but we were contacted by the American fishing industry lobbyist head who wanted to come and meet with us. Well, I have to tell you, imagine the sight of 15 nuns meeting with this lobbyist who comes in with his opening line is, "I went to Catholic school." Didn't go well for him. That's right. Our advocates were prepared and wanted to talk about why hadn't the fishing industry come to the table on labeling? Why hadn't the fishing industry, responded to ideas about bringing forward things like the California supply chain transparency in other states that they were working in? Why hadn't the fishing industry supported the supply chain transparency bill? I think the high point of the meeting was when at this point, beleaguered fishing representative said to one of the sisters that labeling didn't really work. So this year, our project was called Labeling for Lent, and similarly, we released a survey, 5-question, not super sophisticated SurveyMonkey survey. We didn't get as many this time, 15,000, but still a lot. We sent the letter, and we have another meeting with the fishing industry representative who this time is willing to come and meet with us and talk about possibly being a sponsor, of legislation when it is introduced on supply chain transparency. So I think, some of my colleagues can speak a little bit more to the corporate. I know from the idea of who does corporate answer to, the consumer, that power is alive and well.
So friend or foe, a couple things maybe nuanced about it. First this, I think many people in human rights, to be frank about it, when they think about companies, they'd assume foe. And you hear the word neoliberalism and it's already, terrible capitalism, evil, bad. So immediately foe. I don't buy into that notion. Just having interacted with people in this project, I remember speaking to a corporate executive who talked about turning their quality assurance department into a human rights organization because they actually have access in textiles. They can see things that we will never be able to gain entry and to be able to see. So I just don't buy that notion that they're foe, inherently antithetical to what human rights people are trying to do. More diplomatically, I think we just assume we'll give them the benefit of the doubt in this project that they're friendly to us, that they're going to be open to this information, that would be willing to make changes, that they would be willing to listen to us, that we've discovered a risk in their supply chains, a problem in their supply chains that perhaps they didn't know about, even though I find it hard to believe they didn't know about it in some cases. Mm-hmm. But the question that came to me over the data and those who are working on it is did the companies know that these suppliers have this history of forced labor? Do they care to know? Or do they care at all? Mm-hmm. And we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt and let them answer that question. I will say this, though. They really need to be allies. They need to be friends in this, not just because we bring them kicking and dragging and because, the stories about the break in the Associated Press or whatever it may be, because they can literally find things. Give you one example from the reports. We found about 42% of the companies that we looked at that were trading with dirty list companies. By the dirty list, I mean companies that appear on an official Brazilian list or registry of companies where labor inspectors have found people living in conditions analogous to slavery, which is broader than forced labor. About 79 U.S. companies are trading with these dirty list companies. We've tracked shipments in the weeks and months before the labor inspectors got there and discovered the slavery. So think about it. That's when the slaves are being used. If you're using slavery on November 9th, that's when the inspectors come. You're damn sure we're using it on November 8th. But think about that for a second. Brazil's got 3.5 million square miles, 2 labor inspecting groups for the entire company. If U.S. companies inspected the work sites of their own suppliers, they could likely find the slaves before the authorities, or that the authorities would never find. So we need them to be friends because they can actually be eyes and ears. And I don't know how to do it, but if we can convince them, it's more than a question of your stock is going to decline and your sales are going to drop off. No one's going to get tuna for Lent. If it's really going to be, you can actually free people. And by the way, forced labor is the worst form of corruption any company can face, and companies hate working in corrupt environments. So if we can get them to understand that, but to the point, in my interactions with people in this project, my understanding is the corporate executives understand this better already than we do.
Well, friends, I think friend is a strong word. We are friends on Facebook with the companies. But I think, joking aside, I think, there can be a good ally because if we talk about extended supply chains, companies can bring the power to change, transform the situations for the better in some of these economies where people would be at a disadvantage anyways. And they can bring that new standard to a place where the standards didn't exist. Many of the companies that we work with, they're looking at ways to up the bottom line, not to just be compliant with the local law, but go above and beyond that. So we shouldn't forget about those. I mean, I'm not saying all of the companies are like these, but the companies that we make examples of are like these. Of course, it's the jobs, it's the wages, it's the knowledge, it's the opportunities that they bring to those economies. Of course, there's always the other side to that, which is, exploitation, pollution, and all kinds of other things. But there is a power to transform. And of course, we can't say black or white here because it all depends on the company. Some companies are responsive to change, some companies are responsive to pressure, and some are not. And in those cases, that's where we file the resolutions. And that's where we kind of whistle the bell, and that's where we call the media. So some are, of course, nicer, and others are not. It all depends.
That feeds into what you said earlier about really what you need to do is transform the structural causes of slavery and alleviate those differences. And so companies can be allies, potentially can be really strong allies in that.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
So continuing with you then, the last part of this line of questioning has to do with what are effective strategies to influence the companies. I mean, should there be regulatory limits? Should there be law? Should it be, just having them come along for the ride voluntarily?
A number of those. I mean, we use every tool available to us from regulatory drivers, and there are not that many of those. And of course, we advocate for more detailed requirements for the companies. Right now, they're kind of soft laws that don't require much. The disclosures that we have seen so far is one paragraph, and it's not enough to inform nor consumers or investors on what the companies are doing to really respond to allegations of slavery or prevent human trafficking in their supply chains. So it needs to be much more detailed. And right now I'm filing resolutions with the companies who have done absolutely nothing, but also with companies that have the policies already and have disclosed just a little bit, but it's still not enough. And it's not regular enough. And I think the key to all of this is the regular follow-up and the regular implementation and follow through, because it doesn't mean I think if you just stop in the middle and don't fix the problem. So we use the power of allies and NGOs that provide us with information that is highly customized and local to those markets. And I think that is very important because for good solutions, there needs to be customized answers. And we like to look at things globally, what are some of the best practices for all of these industries, but also what really fixes the problem is the very customized solutions for each supply chain, for each particular structure, true to those geopolitical situations, to the local legislation. So as detailed as possible. Investor pressure, of course, is not the last one on this list.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think, do either one of you want to add to that? Because we've addressed that, I think.
Well, I would add, when we think about accountability regimes, I think, we've mentioned the international system and the UN Compact. Obviously, bringing business to the table is important. I've mentioned, and it's been discussed a little bit, regulatory, so the existence of laws or introducing laws. But another piece here is also litigation. As it relates to, there have been some cases over the years relating to the Alien Tort Statute that are very important in terms of saying, and this issue is currently being reevaluated by some of the courts and may go up to the Supreme Court again, but about corporate accountability for human rights abuses in the international context. It's still, I think, an unsettled area of law, but very much important. And if you look at some of the cases that were brought, many of them are actually forced labor cases, that have been brought by individuals who were exploited by companies, in some instances U.S. companies, overseas, and kind of the nexus about that conduct. So I do think that's an additional important thing to look at and evaluate.
Yeah, I think, as you know, because you've been involved in the project, our research supports calls for Federal Transparency and Supply Chain Act. Because when you look at the statements, because this company's public record in the Bloomberg case, National Materials Trading, after they were sort of caught, right? They put out this statement. It was less than a paragraph. No. And it said simply that they strictly monitor their suppliers and encourage their suppliers to, right? Encourage, probably not a strong enough word when you're looking at this. We would like to think they're friends and that if they sort of undertook those things, verify their entire supply chains to assess the risk and audit and demand certification, all those things, that would we would like them to do that voluntarily because it would be beneficial to their companies. But my hunch is they're not going to do it voluntarily unless there's a law and they have to comply with the law. Beyond that, though, I would like to see it's been illegal to import goods made with forced labor since 1930. Yeah. And the Obama administration, 2015, Congress enacted, the President signed Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. I've talked to someone in the Labor Department who says their concern is they're interested more in trade facilitation than trade enforcement. But under the act, if I have this right, Customs and Border Protection can seize shipments if there is a reasonable but not conclusive showing that the goods in those containers were made at least in part with forced labor. I'd like to see Customs and Border Protection enforce that. Now, I know in the shrimping thing there was some seizures. Bad publicity is one thing. The nuns scare the hell out of me. Being up in front of them.
Literally.
But literally, yes, right? Did they wrap knuckles? I could just see this. Bad tuna producer. But there's nothing like having so many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of goods stuck someplace in a port in New Orleans because Customs and Border Protection. So I think we really need to, at some point, we really need to get serious about this.
What I'd like to do, if anyone has any questions, is we have time for one or two questions right now before we then continue back to the panel. Okay. I think they're going to bring a mic to you.
You can have this one.
Thanks, man. Cut you off.
I have sort of two pieces of this question. One is that there was I think that the people who do analysis of business risk are getting it, because there was a report that came out that talked about the increased business risk associated with Trump's migration policies in terms of increasing the probability of slavery for companies as a concern and a business risk. So sort of there's a piece of that gets, in other words, the business people are sort of getting that. On the other hand, if you look at economic policy in general, there's a link between the kinds of neoliberal policies that we're pushing and the conditions that lead to slavery. You talked about how, you can talk about the companies doing the right thing, but as long as Burma is in the situation it's in and there are all those refugees who are being enslaved in Thailand, then you still have that situation. And there's certainly a narrative for the cocoa fields in Cote d'Ivoire that it was the IMF, World Bank imposition that you need to have free markets in the commodities exchanges. And of course, the commodities exchanges are very, very difficult to police in terms of all these goods, some of it slave labor, some of it not slave labor, coming together to be sold, and you don't know whose cocoa really it is you're buying anyway. That all of that sort of seems to both undermine enforcement and also reinforce the economic benefit of using forced labor. And so I was wondering if you could comment about those questions.
All right. So we have one more?
It's probably maybe more of a statement to you and an encouragement to you. First off, no one scares me more in the world than Sister Barbara.
Oh.
Okay, and she works for the Interfaith Center.
I share the sentiment.
Yeah, she can have the CEO of GM sit down and be very quiet and hold his head down while she sternly lectures him. But I think the point that I wanted to make to the entire group, not only this stage but here as well, is supply chain transparency. It is something that we all have to continue to work at and continue to push corporations to do. And by the way, when you create supply chain transparency, it is an ongoing, forever process. You have to constantly look through your entire supply chain to clearly understand that it's functioning well. It's not something you do one time. And I'd encourage you, although the Fish Association has their representatives, it's sitting with corporations and asking them the question, do you have supply chain transparency? For example, in the fishing industry, are boats transporting fish from boat to boat at sea, and we can't see the conditions of where that is coming from, and those companies requiring complete authenticity of only what was caught on that boat is purchased to port. And so it's a very complex issue, and foe or friend, 97% friend, there's 3% foe out there. There's always bad actors in almost all of our industries, people who are looking to cut corners, but I commend the comments that I've heard there, but please, I would ask everybody to push this supply chain transparency. It's very important for corporations to constantly hear it.
So just to give a quick plug on the bill. There has been in Congress for the past 3 sessions a bill called the Supply Chain Transparency Act. In the House, it's been introduced by Chris Smith, who's a Republican from New Jersey, and Carolyn Maloney, who's a Democrat from New York. So bipartisan, which is a good start. It has not been introduced this session, and we think some of it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of activity on the reauthorization for this year, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that has not yet occurred. But to be candid with you, it's an uphill battle to get this bill introduced every session. We have a lot of people who work on this, but we need a lot more. And we need people to come in and say, you need to be looking at this bill and you need to be considering co-sponsoring. To Republicans, Democrats, representatives, senators. We can follow up a little bit more about some of the strategies on that, but it is a really good way, I think, and it's really important that it's introduced every session and that it gains sponsors every session. maybe not is going to pass at this time, but shows momentum and shows impetus and frankly shows political will.
Thanks. And then, which of you, going back to the question or the comment about policy and the conditions promoting slavery?
Well, I mean, my reflection on the Trump policy or anybody else who stops or tries to prevent migration, it will never work. It will, of course, increase the vulnerability of the people that are trying to migrate, and that only means that on the other side of the border, there will be recruiters that will be charging more. Because now the entrance is denied to many and it's that much more difficult. So from that point of view, yeah, of course it will be promoting slavery, promoting vulnerability, which to me equates with slavery eventually. Yeah, I don't think there is a force in the world that can stop labor migration, besides, the policies that change the livelihoods of the people in the country and change the reality of that country. So as long as those drivers are in place, people will be migrating, and there will be more vulnerability.
So let me say something about an encounter I had with a Trump Labor Department political appointee who was aware of this research we was doing. And you can help me with my ethical dilemma on how to deal with this. So I have this long conversation. A political appointee to the Labor Department calls a friend of mine to talk about Catholic social teaching and the dignity of work. And someone happened to be Charlie Clark at St. John's, who happened to be working on his Brazil project, and Charlie calls me and says, you got to talk to this guy. And I shared just in generic terms, we found this list, and this guy says, President Trump is committed to enforcing the trade facilitation and trade. He wants to stop this goods made with forced labor from coming in. Send us the data. We'll put you in front of the right people. And I'm thinking we've got access to the Labor Department. But it became very, very clear that this was part of Trump's anti-immigration policy. Build the wall, stop them from coming and working, stop their trade, so we'll buy American, right? So on the one hand, he's saying, they sort of want us to be complicit and say everything's forced labor, don't buy anything, buy American. So how do I deal with this? Answer the call the next guy comes? I mean, we've got someone in the Labor Department who wants to talk, but it's really clear that they have sort of they have ulterior motives in wanting to work with us on enforcing the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act.
So I would just say, and go back to the example of Rolando, he came here on a visa, a worker visa. And right now, we all know that there's a lot of discussion about immigration reform that's going on in Congress as well as at the White House. And one of the pieces on the table is the discussion of reforming guest worker visa programs and work visa programs. An Urban Institute study from 2015 that did one of the most in-depth so far studies about labor trafficking victims in the United States found that roughly 70% of identified labor trafficking victims came here legally. They came here through our guest worker program. So you see, I think, individuals who have records of immigration restriction pushing for large guest worker visa program extensions that erode certain protections that now are questionably enforced. And so I think more attention needs to be given to the idea of not only, what we would describe as irregular migration and its connection to human trafficking and slavery, but regular migration that is used to facilitate, businesses and ends up exploiting people as well.
Ashley hit the nail on the head here. There's something that I kind of forgot to mention. Since our resolutions for the tobacco companies a few years ago, I've been a part of this multi-stakeholder dialogue on U.S. agriculture, mainly stemming from the actions that the tobacco industry took to eliminate or attempt to eliminate some of the problems in the United States and U.S. farming. And we've been looking at this issue for now 3.5 years. What I can say is that we don't know what is worse, the undocumented migrants and their situation and their vulnerabilities, or those that are H2A, H2B. Because that legal status in the United States gives those workers a preferential status where more farmers would like to work with them now, and that, of course, is more expensive to get. And for that, you need to pay recruitment fees that can range from $2,000 over in Latin America, anywhere in Central America, to $10,000 for a period of time which is between 6 to 9 months. That's all they get. And pending the weather conditions and the crop rotation, or however, who is your farm labor contractor where you get to pick the crops, actually, there is no guarantee that those workers actually will ever earn the $10,000 to pay back to those recruiters. So that's a channel to modern day slavery right here in the United States. If you want to fight modern day slavery, we should start with the United States, with U.S. agriculture. U.S. agriculture is one of the biggest zones for agriculture in the world. There are some crops that are number 1, number 2 in the world. Cotton, for example, one of my favorite commodities. I worked on that initiative a few years ago, but definitely there's a lot of that. Tobacco is another one, and many others. And who picks the crops? I mean, depending on the reports, and again, right now, it's very hard to find the good statistics that are recent, that are relevant to us, and kind of crop by crop, but I mean, we can safely say that between 60 to 90% of those workers are all migrants. And we don't even have the data on undocumented migrants. So here we have it. We are at the center of exploitation of workers.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. One comment about, we've worked with CIW, the Coalition for Immokalee Workers, in the past, had them on campus a few times. I really highly recommend their program, the Fair Food Program, where it's a certification scheme and label now for produce that's picked ethically. I guess it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's a good way to head towards it. But I think it's an interesting way to look at it. The incidence of sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and exploitation of U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, and mostly migrants in the fields in southern Florida picking tomatoes. That was at least what it originally started as. But they've, using a lot of different tactics, have gotten most major consumers of tomatoes to sign onto their agreement to put money back into a fund to the growers, manage to increase the working conditions in the fields, and to make agreements to stop at least the most egregious of the violations.
But on that point, because this has been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. You said at the beginning that human trafficking is the worst form of exploitation. Well, we tend to look at the worst form of exploitation, whether it's in the fields. And I remember looking at domestic work when the ILO passed that convention on domestic work, where a lot of these people were on visas. We tend to forget, and I see this with both documented and undocumented migrants in the Miami Valley that I encounter a lot, who work in the restaurants, who work in the hospitality industry, and work in all sorts of things. I don't know that I've ever seen a case of forced labor, but I've seen a lot of cases of pretty serious, ranging from mild to pretty serious labor abuses. I mean, there's no overtime pay, there's no benefits, 7-day work weeks. I mean, things that you don't necessarily have a conference about because it's not forced labor or human trafficking, but it's pretty darn serious. And it does affect their ability to pay off the coyotes. The going rate's about $6 grand. And the other piece of that is, I think, in terms of labor inspections and labor enforcement, if you're not looking for sort of run-of-the-mill labor abuses, you're not going to find the really serious ones. And so I think, this question of documented and undocumented, their vulnerabilities, yes, they're vulnerable to the worst form of exploitation, labor exploitation, forced labor, and everything else, but they get abused in all sorts of less serious but nonetheless important ways.
Anyone want to add to that? We talk a lot about a spectrum of exploitation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would just say, we talk about the continuum or spectrum of exploitation, and we see a lot of individuals who wage theft, maybe incidents of harassment, obviously taking of documents, because we do serve a lot of foreign nationals. And I would say there are sometimes some difficulties when we're talking about labor trafficking, labor exploitation, and forced labor to document and engage fully with the U.S. government and others on this issue in terms of proving whether it would be to come to receive a T visa or eligibility short-term wise, something like continued presence. But I do think that's also part of kind of the discussion as to maybe it is on the continuum, maybe it isn't compared when we think about sex trafficking or something else, but it is still exploitation that is affecting someone's livelihood and someone's human dignity.
I agree. I think we're all on the same page on that one. Hopefully everyone in here is. I would like to go back. I mentioned earlier I'd like to talk about victim services. I think a lot of us can agree that's where, in spite of all the great policies, all the great work that we've done, the actual victim-centered approach and coming up with the services for the victims. So we know the trauma that trafficking victims go through is incredible. It's terrible, and it takes a very long time to help heal, repair, restore, reintegrate into society, and we don't have the money for that, especially for U.S. domestic victims, at least not yet. So what can we do to really improve the victim-centered nature of these laws and improve victim services?
I can start.
Good.
In our programming, like I said, we work in partnership with the U.S. government, and there are services. But when we think about long-term reintegration for foreign nationals and for U.S. citizens, there's some of the maybe less glamorous but very important day-to-day life elements that we need. A big one, housing. Okay, there's a real lack of long-term housing, reintegrative housing for individuals. Another one is job training and basic education, and also the issue of restitution, which is really important, and the issue of criminal expungement. Also, these are obstacles that prevent people who maybe are trafficking survivors at this point, and they are looking to reintegrate into society, but like the rest of us, they need meaningful work. And it's really hard, for a foreign national who maybe is in the process of getting their T visa, but they, are facing obstacles relating to lack of training, lack of language skills. Same thing for a U.S. citizen, survivor who perhaps has a criminal record relating to something that happened during their period of exploitation to try and enter the job market. So these are things that we see as obstacles. Some of it has to do with legislation. There are a couple bills in place to talk about expungement. Senator Gillibrand of New York is a leading sponsor for one of them. But another thing I think is also community and public-private partnership for things like job training. That's something that can be done at the community level, and we can take from existing models like the resettlement model and immigration legal service providers who have ancillary training. I think it does have to start, though, with the governments themselves, who need to put in a commitment to a parity of funding when it relates to reintegrative services.
I mean, in the project in Brazil, we're not involved, obviously, in providing any services. I can just simply say, when people are fortunate enough, it's a small percentage, a fraction of the real number of people are rescued at a work site. Some are given papers for the first time, and sometimes the companies are fined and they're forced to pay back wages, and people do get that. But just statistically, between a third and a half of all people who've been rescued, as we've documented, had been rescued before. So they get right. Vulnerability still exists. I was just thinking out loud, which is dangerous sometimes. I wonder, in terms of providing people with sex trafficked or whatever it may be, in terms of providing opportunities, educational opportunities, job opportunities, what the role of, I don't know, a major Catholic university in the Midwest could do. I'm just speculating.
Do you have anyone in mind? Or?
Just maybe look for one that has a human rights center.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll add to that. Of course, we don't work directly with the victims of human trafficking, but we try to prevent the workers that are working for the corporations that we engage from becoming those victims. And for that, our policy is a 3-pillar prescription to, first of all, ease and eliminate any cases of deception on the job, which is the leading factor for human trafficking, and working the contracts written in a language that workers can understand is the key for that. And you would be surprised how many companies don't have that provision in their codes of conduct and their supplier code of conduct, and it's a very basic one. Another one would be, of course, the prohibition on retention of identity documents that would allow workers to move freely if they don't like their conditions of employment. So if they were deceived, they at least can leave. And that has to be written in stone in the policy. And just a general statement, oh, we prohibit forced labor, well, that doesn't suffice anymore by our standards. And of course, the most difficult of them is the reimbursement of recruitment fees that were paid, and just any kind of reimbursement that hasn't been done by many companies. I mean, Apple, Patagonia, there are a few examples, Unilever, around that have done reimbursement, but we're gearing more companies to understand the problem of recruitment and see how they can reimburse. Difficult case because usually companies are not directly involved in the reimbursement. They usually work out a case-by-case situation with their suppliers, and usually that reimbursement portion falls on the shoulders of the suppliers. Companies occasionally, if they're really good players, if it's a smaller company, they can offer to substitute or offer to assist the supplier in reimbursement. But we were talking about years back, and the sums, I've been in a few audits, we calculated those were enormous, and they scared the supplier and the company alike. So of course prevention is the key to further actions, right? And so far, it's still a new topic. It's still a new topic. We've been talking about recruitment maybe for the 4 years now. We only now, ILO has agreed on what constitutes recruitment fees. There was a document that went to print, I think, at the end of last year. And we are now kind of digesting it slowly and trying to share it with the companies that we work with. So, I mean, these things take time, but those are the three main provisions. So, of course, working directly, hiring workers directly. If a company is big enough, they can establish a mechanism and work out an MOU, which is a memorandum of understanding with another country, to eliminate some of those government-imposed fees. And if they have, let's say, a surge of labor, if they have a surge of demand, they can get that labor fast across the border without paying all of those fees, and they can just facilitate the process. So there are a number of tools that we are using. What else can help the workers? I mean, just pay them, treat them with respect, and just respect the UN Declaration of Human Rights and international laws on the topic. There are plenty of materials on the subject, and there are so many requirements, but companies, you would be amazed that they don't do that very often. They have to be reminded, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies and suppliers hide behind the idea of we're paying the national minimum wage as opposed to an actual true living wage.
Yeah, and there's another thing that I've noticed, of course, the way, the kind of paradigms of labor and supply chains have changed, and where workers, many companies have supply chains that are located in Asia, let's say. Let's just take that example, in industrial parks. And this is definitely not a sustainable model of living. Like to live in a dorm without a family for several years, to have 2 hours for some sort of an outdoor activity like basketball, and for the rest of the time you're just locked and you're just working. This is just crazy. Even if the worker is willing to work overtime, this is, this is just not a way to go. And many factories operate that way. Also, United States, how much those workers are getting paid in United States per hour. No U.S. citizen would like to get that wage here. So we're talking about a wage dilemma again. It has to be a living wage with discretionary income. How are we going to fix that? So there's a lot to think about.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. For me, to really get a more victim-centered approach and to really help victim services, we need to include survivor voices in the development of the policy and in the implementation. You can't do it without the people who've actually lived through it and get their input as well. And so many times we don't. It's so many people sitting around a table, trying to decide what's good for other people without actually getting their perspective. So it's really critical.
There's a question.
Yeah, give me just one more minute. I want to wrap up one little thing with us, and then we'll turn it over to questions for the last 15 minutes. There's lots of organizations combating modern slavery, a large growing number, and that's good because there's power in numbers, but also they are in competition with one another in many cases for, in many ways, increasingly scarce resources. Mm-hmm. So what would you like to see to enable, besides unlimited funding, to let us collaborate and coordinate all of our actions more better?
More better.
Yeah, more effectively.
I mean, I can maybe start here.
Sure.
I would say maybe utilizing each organization's comparative advantage.
Okay.
In fighting that, because it's indeed, we've seen an increased number of applicants for the same grants. We've seen a lot of competition for funding, and we've seen a lot of overlap in some of the work that we do, but it doesn't mean that our colleagues have exactly the same perspective or the same strength. So I think here, with many actors, the rule is to stay in your lane, I guess, and understand what that lane is and what exactly you're contributing. I think there cannot be too many players in this field anyways, because everybody has a role and it takes a village to change these things. But at the same time, if we take one industry, for example, if our angle is shareholder advocacy, that's our angle, and we'll stick with that. And then but we have a number of corporations that are publicly traded that we're engaging. It doesn't mean that somebody else can engage other corporations or even overlap with us on some of the issues. We welcome collaboration, but at the same time, yeah, there are those different nuances that we have to respect one another. Yeah.
I mean, I can just say, again, from the perspective of this project, we know we're not going to have the impact of this report unless we were collaborating with the Interfaith Center, with MRS, and so many others. I mean, this report will have our logo on it, and we did the research, but in terms of where we go here from the advocacy, reaching out to the companies, just to know how to do that, your expertise. We have corporate executives we consult with on this. But just having a lot of voices on the law. Do a lot of NGOs come out and say, we as an issue by issue or concern by concern, if we band together on that law, just as an aside, I know we're constantly trying to get it reintroduced and passed, but I wonder if we need to strengthen it or whether that's a bridge too far. Because it doesn't say anything about restitution. Tell us, disclose what you're doing in terms of restitution. But I just think that issue by issue, if we could all band together, even if it's not going to be a grand permanent alliance, we're not NATO here, but yeah, that's one reason we wanted this plenary and to reach out to you, to know that we're going to be coming to you for your advice and then maybe your collaboration as we go forward.
So, I mean, I think the point about there can't be too many actors because we haven't solved this problem is a good one. I think what's important is to take upon the lessons learned and add value in the sense of add contributions to the field. If you're great at doing prevention work, then that's what you should be doing and not trying to do other types of work. If you are an expert service provider, same goes there. I think it is really important to kind of collaborate and look. This is an interconnected human rights problem, and to segment actions on this leads us to, frankly, where we are, where we have not eliminated it. It is one of the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of a hopeful, elimination set forth in SDG 8.7. But I would just say, I think that more collaboration, but also building upon the existing work that's been done, it is the way to go here.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. All right, let's take a few questions.
21 back in the corner. There's a couple.
Yeah, I can't see past the podium.
Thank you for this panel and for your work. I think this is important work to address the short and medium term interests of our human rights movement. But I want to raise an uncomfortable question and an observation that we live in a system of globalized capitalism that isn't about human rights. And in fact, it's in contradiction with human rights. It's about making profits and exploiting labor and the environment in order to do that. So I wonder if we're spending an inordinate amount of our energies as a movement to make capitalism less bad, when we should be spending at least a little more of our energies thinking about how we construct a globalized system that is organized around a vision of protecting and promoting human rights. Because I think there is a contradiction between the system we have and our values and principles of human rights.
Thank you. You too? Yeah, that's pretty good.
I don't know if I should agree.
Get other one, please.
You just took the first part of my comment. Again, thank you for your important work, and it was really fascinating to hear how you use as you said, every tool at your disposal to try to wheedle or put pressure or use anything you can, right, to improve conditions for people. But we are in this situation. I think it's very inadequate to conceptualize it as a few bad actors or a few bad apples, because it really is systemic and structural, and it's the same collectives, the same groups that continue to occupy the vulnerable side of this continuum of exploitation that you're talking about. So you mentioned the people falling back in, right, after being rescued, so the failure of rescue, really. And I want to tell one anecdote from my own research that I've worked looking at a program that the government of El Salvador has a three-part agreement between the government of El Salvador, the government of Canada, and certain Canadian corporations, specifically meatpacking corporations, to bring workers from El Salvador to Canada. And they name this as like an orderly and ethical way to recruit migratory workers, right? Under their and they get a temporary foreign worker status within Canada. If you go to Maple Leaf Foods website, this Canadian company, they literally call this on their website importing workers. And so of course, the way that the governments frame this, and the companies as well, is as an alternative to the exploitative process of undocumented migration, and that this is going to bring this into an orderly, regulated space that will therefore be humane and protect the rights of the workers. But one of the things I found in my research was that their conditions are very similar, as you were saying, with the temporary worker programs in the United States. So one of the things that I like to think of as maybe a potentially transformative approach to this problem, and I wanted to get your feedback on that idea, is to advocate for the recognition of the right to migrate globally, the right to move across borders, right? And I think it's a little bit of a distinct angle than the notion of open borders, right? But to name the right to migrate and to advocate for it. So what potential do you all see in that framing for more of a structural transformation of these problems? Thanks.
Well, two different structural questions. So let's do these.
Third structural one. Yeah, she had.
Is it structural too? Oh, boy. All right. I can't wait for this. You guys.
Yeah. I do appreciate all the work that you do, and I am of the Protestant faith, and I am part of an organization called Churches Witnessing with Migrants. And one of the things that we say, or the major thing that we say, is in dealing with migrants, we look at the work from considering two sides of it. One is mercy, and the other one is justice. And I think I see, I could relate or identify the things that have been mentioned by the panelists in light of mercy. But coming from a country where there is an ongoing war, I would rather look at it as the image that I'd like to situate the migrants issue is like a war where there are people who are wounded and are forced to go to a hospital, a room, and to be treated, and not unless the issue of justice is addressed, then it is going to be like that all the time, more wounded, more, and all our efforts and energies will be, while they are important and necessary, will be focused on to treating the wound, making corporations do their well, and related things. But from the perspective of a war-torn country, what we would like to see is how the war will stop, how the wounded will be, how we will not be adding into the list of wounded and killed. So my question then from that perspective is, because I know, I believe that we all share that vision, and yet how do we see any integration of mercy and justice in the work that we do? And justice being the framework, and mercy as one that accompanies those who are victimized by injustice.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah. You're picking up your mic, Ashley. Is that?
I guess I'll go. I guess just you. I'm going to respond to you because you're most recent. I mean, I would say on the issue of justice in the American context, much resources have been put forth to for that prosecution, for that element of going after traffickers and engagement. And you have several individuals in the Senate in particular, Senator Cornyn and Senator Grassley, who this is where they come from. They're, Senator Cornyn was a prosecutor, and that's how he sees this issue. That's very important. And I understand that looking at the number of prosecutions and convictions are very important. But you bring up this point, and I think it's just as vital. Mercy needs to be there too, intertwined with justice, because we can have as many prosecutions of traffickers and going after bad corporate actors, but if we don't see actual service to those who've been exploited, it's just not really going to solve the issue. So again, that goes back to the argument, and I'm happy to make it that we need to do a better job on reintegrative services and also services as it relates to the corporate exploitation as well. But I think that right now we do have more of a focus on that justice element. Have we seen justice that would make us all feel, I think, that we're getting the work done? No. I would say the reality is prosecuting human trafficking cases in the United States is a relatively new phenomena, and prosecuting labor trafficking cases has proven to be extremely difficult. I'd say that there's 15 major large-scale, like what we saw with Signal in New Orleans in the past 7 years, really. They're newer. Frankly, it's just more difficult. You have federal and state prosecutors who they're looking to get a conviction, so maybe they knock down the charge, which inadvertently, unfortunately, has made victims ineligible for certain types of services, right? Mm-hmm. Another one of these unintended consequences sometimes. We are making progress on this, but I do agree with your vision that justice and mercy must be intertwined if we're going to resolve that issue. And then I'll do the rest.
The revolution, right? The question about the revolution. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see the world's, I'd like to see the compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church be sort of the manifesto for the New World Order. Justice and mercy and societies based on truth. Beyond that, I'll talk about, I hinted at this at the beginning. I'm not one who necessarily subscribes to the view that market economies and globalization is inherently evil. It's not an intrinsic evil. And I will just base it on a couple things. I know more about pig iron supply chains than I ever wanted to do when I did my doctorate. I can give you the names of hundreds and hundreds of importers of sugar and ethanol and iron ore and pig iron and lumber and building materials and tobacco, right, from Brazil. and the worst affected. And I can name 200 companies that have had sometimes one-off or two-off trade with the dirty list company, some with more extensive long-term relationships. But that 200 companies is a fraction of the companies that are sourcing those goods from Brazil. In other words, what I'm getting at is I see a lot more companies that are not involved in exploitation, and that just can't be accidental. That can't be accidental. It's got to be because they have policies in place. And it has to be because they're alert to the risk of exploitation and they don't want anything to do with it. So this notion that if the capitalism is inherently evil, I've just never thought that was much of a useful conversation. I remember when I was getting my human rights training at the Inter-American Institute for Human Rights in 1993, one of the questions in a workshop that was posed to me is, this human rights movement, answer this question in Spanish. The human rights movement is discredited because you're not talking about derechos humanos, human rights, you're talking about izquierdos humanos, leftist rights, that this is a sort of a leftist view of the world. And so I've just, those sort of big questions, I was going to focus on the research because I don't know how we get there. Final anecdote. I was getting on a plane in El Salvador, and I was flying with Eduardo Sanchez, who was Comandante Ferman Cienfuegos of the FMLN. And we're flying into San Jose, Costa Rica together, and I said, Eduardo, why are you flying to Marxist guerrilla? And he said, I'm going to attend a seminar on neoliberalism. The point was, this is the game.
Do you want to handle migration?
Migration. Well, I wish I could. I think this is a question that should be posed to somebody from the government side. Mm-hmm. I think from the interfaith perspective, from the perspective of investors, there's not much we can do. I think we understand that people have the right to migrate, and companies do too. They would never turn a worker who is a migrant worker. They actually welcome that in their supply chains, not because it costs less, actually it costs exactly the same, sometimes even more, because they have to reimburse the fees and there are other associated costs. But most of the companies that we work with that have large supply chains and do have migrant workers don't have anything against working with migrant workers. They give that right implicitly, right? The rest of it is a debate for the governments. What are the protections? So what is the responsibility of these actors? What is the responsibility of the government for this kind of a reform? If things were that easy, why not? But there are certain costs associated with that.
So just pivoting, for Catholic social teaching on migration, the first right is the right to migrate, right? But the second right is the right not to migrate. And I think we spend a lot of time on the first one in our country here and whether that exists or not. But the second one's really important too, right? And there are frameworks that I think, you're right, they do need to be kind of looked at, I think, more holistically. And I think governments are a place, but I think the international community is a place. I mentioned in your panel earlier, we are beginning the UN Global Compact on Migration negotiations. There's two sides. There's the migration and the refugee side, and all countries are participating. And this is a discussion that needs to occur there, and I think will occur, but more, to your point, more thinking and more kind of pronouncing that does need to come out, I think, from other places as well, right? It's clear that is not, I think, a recognized right, at least with how we're handling our migration system at this time, and other countries are actually following suit. But it doesn't mean that it's not a valuable framework that should be probably the evaluative way which we move forward. Yeah, it hasn't been implemented, right? Let's look at NAFTA, right? So this whole idea, it was going to make us better or whatnot, but labor wasn't even on the table. And it's not going to be now either.
And by the right not to migrate is the first right in Catholic social teaching, but.
Right. I think that was a good way to close. It's not on the table. Let's make sure that we put labor back on the table. I want to thank our panelists and thank everyone for being here.